Hello and welcome back to the Marketing for Speakers podcast. I hope you're having a great week. It's off to an awesome start. And this week, we get to talk with Roger Rickard. Now, this guy is known as the big guy with the bow tie. It is so fun. And he's just a great human being, has an amazing platform that helps companies and organizations build better advocates. And basically, we're going to talk about what that means, and then we're going to dive into podcasting, how it could help and grow your business and your influence. So stay tuned and please enjoy this episode with Roger Rickard. Welcome to another episode of the Marketing for Speakers podcast. I'm really excited about today. We're on a video chat with Roger Rickard, the big guy with the bow tie, baby. Roger, how you doing?
I'm great, rocking the bow tie today.
I love it, man. I love your brand. I'm excited to chat with you today. Could you give our guests just an overview of who you are and what you do?
Well, I'm the big guy with the bow tie. No, I am the president and founder of a firm called Voices in Advocacy, where we help organizations grow their advocates. So as a professional speaker, host of my own podcast, the Voices in Advocacy podcast, which you can get anywhere you get your podcasts. But we reach out and we help organizations find more advocates and turn them into effective, influential champions for their cause.
That's really interesting. So what is, for example, like a company who says, hey, this guy Roger's really cool. He's a great speaker. He's going to come in and he's going to transform my members, my customers into like effective people that can go and speak well of me? Or how would you tell this to a third grader?
That's usually who I have to speak to. Anyhow, the best way, I do a large majority of my work within the association world, the nonprofit world, the cause world, trade organizations that one of their pillars of their strategic plan is that they advocate to defend, fill in the blank, whatever that defense is.
Okay.
So I do an awful lot of work in the agriculture space. So I may be defending farmers who own family farms. And what I do is I help teach those farmers who aren't normally people that are in the halls of Congress or state legislatures dealing with elected officials, how to really be comfortable in that environment, how to prove that they know so much more about their business than the elected officials know about their business. So, an elected official oftentimes has a vast array of knowledge that's about an inch thick and 20 miles wide. They know about every little thing out there, but they don't know much about it. And people that work in their profession are a mile high and an inch wide with their knowledge of their industry. So by making them more comfortable in the process and going in and being able to tell their story in their way about their personal struggles and why they need to either defend and protect something or whether they need more or less of, whatever the case may be, is I teach them how to go in and communicate effectively. And that's really what elected officials want. They want people to come in and tell them exactly where the pain is and what's going on.
Yes. And now that you say that and I'm learning more about it, your name is great. Voices in Advocacy. You're teaching people to use their voices to become advocates for the things they care about or their trades, their livelihoods, and things like that, so they can affect change. And use them for the organizations. That's really cool.
And I may be viewed a little bit old school in some circles with some people, but I believe fundamentally that if we sit down across the table and can have a cordial debate about a particular issue, that's the way that we should do this. I'm not a big believer in protests. I'm not a big believer in, there are cases where that's the only thing that gets the attention and they need to get the attention. But quite frankly, if you can sit down across the table, I remember a political science instructor I had at at Pennsylvania State University by the name of Lou Leopold. And Professor Leopold said, if you can sit across from him and agree to disagree, but in a cordial manner, you will go a long, long way. So
Yeah.
that's what I teach.
And I can see how it's made an influence on you and your career. Roger, one thing I would love to dive into that you're doing really well and with a very strong purpose in mind is podcasting. You mentioned your podcast, Voices in Advocacy. I would love to dive in. And if there's anybody on the call who's thinking, hey, I should start a podcast or shouldn't I? Why would I do it? Is it a lot of time? Can you just tell us what your podcast is for and why did you start one and how's it going?
I actually started a podcast a little over 4 years ago because that was the thing that I was to do. And and so I learned how to technically put on a podcast, do all the things that get it on air and get people to listen to it.
And when you say that was the thing to do because industry leaders told you to do it, it was popular, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, it was the latest, greatest marketing tool. You can be viewed as an expert in your field if you're the one that controls the podcast, blah, 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 blah down the road. And I agree with all of that. So I dove in. Yes, let's do this. Let's do the podcast. So I created a podcast and I did 7 episodes. And then I stopped. Here's what my challenge was at that point in time. I didn't have real goals and real objectives as to why I should do the podcast, how I should do the podcast, who should be the audience, why should the audience listen, what are they going to get out of it, and really, quite frankly, more importantly, what am I going to get out? Yeah, great exercise, yes. And I will tell you, as someone that has hosted many more episodes now, uh, that you become a much better facilitator, period, when you have to be in an interview process with a guest in a podcast, because you learn to read and react with what's going on, and you learn how to pivot when it's time to pivot. So I did not have, when I started 4 years ago, I had none of those things in my mind. I just thought, well, maybe I'll find an audience and we'll go from there. And it does take some work, and particularly for those people that are solopreneurs that are out there, it takes time and energy and a commitment for consistency. And then you start to say, well, why am I doing this? How come my numbers aren't at 100,000 and a million people right away? And, I backed off. Then the pandemic hits, and anybody that is in the professional speaking business and even direct coaching one-on-one will tell you that when you don't have meetings and there's no conventions, you're not out there speaking. And while we pivoted to a lot of virtual work, I sat down and said, how am I going to gain an audience? Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? And got very involved with a quasi-private group of thought leaders that were either interested in podcasting or had done podcasting. And we had monthly meetings. And after about the third meeting, I had garnered enough knowledge for me to reboot and restart the Voices in Advocacy podcast with incredibly specific goals and objectives.
So what were some of those things that made you say, even though I kind of got burnt out quickly, didn't know why I was doing it, I'm going to pick it back up again? Like, what was the new revelation you had that it could be useful now and it was worth the effort?
I never really answered or even asked the first go around, what do I want? And so when you ask yourself, why would you do this? And what is the end goal for you? And that goal may vary dramatically by the people that are listening to today's podcast. But you have to figure out, why is it important for you? And in my case, and particularly during the pandemic, speakers that reach out and try to do selling directly, was much harder, because if you didn't have their cell phone or if they didn't answer their cell phone, you didn't reach them because they weren't sitting in their office. And you can send emails, but it's really easy for people to ignore emails. So what I chose to do was to say, what is my goal here? I had multiple goals, and that's important too. One goal was to be viewed as a leading authority in this area.
Mhm.
Another goal was to reach organizations that might be hard for me to reach and have a conversation about what they do in the advocacy space, my specialty. And three, try to get the type of people on that I also wanted to be clients.
Perfect.
And in a sense, and I almost hesitate saying this, but in a sense, the purpose was to be able to get them on, give them something in return for their time. So give them a platform to talk about their organization, to talk about how they're conducting all their advocacy efforts, what their successes are, what are their key priorities in doing the work that they do for their particular organization, and giving them the platform to be heard and to use that then within their own organization to be able to then say, hey, John Doe, who is in charge of advocacy for ABC organization, has been on this podcast, and we want to share that with all of our people, all of our members, all of our employees. And that's a great vehicle for them to be heard about what's going on and to get the word out. And for me, it gives me the opportunity to ask a lot of questions about how they do their work so that if I feel that there's a gap somewhere, then maybe because of the relationship we're developing during the podcast, they would be interested in having a conversation on gaps that maybe I could help them fill. So it
Wow.
becomes a sales interview in a sense. But I want to, and that is a goal. I mean, it is clearly a goal. It has gotten me into doors that I did not think I could get into. I now have people that I'm getting emails every week, the people that want to be on the show, which is great, and they're listening. But I want to emphasize my goal wasn't huge numbers. My goal was finding the right people to listen. And so if the people that conduct advocacy around the country are listening to the podcast and gaining nuggets, either sooner or later, something's going to come up and they're going to say, I remember Roger, and I'm going to reach out to Roger. Or they're going to change jobs, and somebody else is going to say, well, in the interim, we need Roger to come in and step in and help us do a few things. Or they're going to go to an organization that has not built what they were used to in the company they were at, and they need jump starting. And I can come in and help with all of that. I will tell you, it's working.
Yeah.
Of all of my downloads, 95% are in the US. And really, the work that I do is primarily based in the US. So I'm hitting my target if 95% of the people listening are in the US. And interestingly enough, the top 5 states in the US account for 62% of my listenership.
Okay. Wow.
And so now I know those states that are listening.
Hmm.
And the areas that I'm targeting are the states that are actually listening. And so by looking at the statistics, I'm on the right track. So I
Yeah.
don't fret over numbers every day about where the podcast is going.
Right.
I had a friend of mine in the industry, Jake, that asked a question. If you had a podcast and only 10 people were listening, is it worth your time? And the analogy was, if you have a podcast on beverages and the CEO of Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Budweiser and whatever wine, if those 10 people are the ones that are listening, maybe it's really worthwhile.
Yeah, it is.
So I think that's a great analogy as to, if the right people are listening and if the right people want to be involved and say yes to be guests, that is, if you're doing an interview and there's
Yeah.
different types of podcasts. Of course.
Yeah. I would definitely want to jump in on this because what you just said, I think, is so profound. And people don't necessarily think that way. Is when people think of podcasting, they think, oh, a successful podcast is one that gets millions of listeners and then we sell ads on it and you build this huge brand. But in reality, if you're a solopreneur like us, if you're a speaker, coach, consultant, author, you're looking at your field and wanting to become an expert in it. And it might not have the numbers. It probably won't have those crazy numbers, but that's only one way to monetize your business. And
Right.
honestly, when you start doing third-party sponsorships and advertisements, it probably takes you outside of your arena of influence anyway. So it might be a way to make money, but not the best way to make money, or maybe even with your mission and purpose in mind. So I think what's really smart about what you did is you took the things you already wanted to do. Hey, I want to establish myself as an expert. I want to meet people in my field that I want to work with and build relationships with. And then I want to invest in them by giving them something of value because that's good marketing. Good marketing is not saying, hey, want to buy my stuff? And then a month later saying, hey, want to buy this other thing? People get tired really quick. So you've added an element to your marketing schedule that allows you to become their friend and advocate before you ever ask for anything. And while they're talking to you, they're building trust with you. And they're saying,
Yeah.
Roger's really cool. He can be very helpful to my business. And so you're building real relationships. And from a marketing standpoint, it's like skipping all the BS and it's going right to like the bread and butter. Like, this is the real deal. This is what we want to happen after 3 or 4 weeks. And you've probably built a system to invite guests that's pretty simple and straightforward and gets people to say, yes, that sounds really cool. So I just want to give you mad kudos because it sounds really awesome and it's working. So have you gotten a few clients from your guests so far? Have they worked with you?
Yes is the answer. And I want to be quick with that answer. Yes. Uh, but I'm thinking, I would say since the relaunch, which was in January of this year, and I do a weekly podcast, I will tell you that I probably have about 40% of the guests that have given me business.
That's really good. Wow.
And one of the ways I do it is, I do not talk about me during the podcast. I talk about them. But if they give me an example of something that I have either seen somewhere else or have done, then I can pipe in.
Yeah.
And so an example of that might be, I might ask a simple question: how are you trying to attract young people to be your advocates in your organization? And they go on and they answer the question to that. And then I'll say, in your experience, are you finding that they're more engaged, less engaged, disconnected, disheartened? What is the issue? And if they say more engaged, then I'll turn around and say, I had a wild opportunity in Texas with a state organization that wanted me to speak to their high school. And I was scared to death going in there because I didn't think that they would pay attention to my topic. And it turned out to be an incredible event because they were really into it. Well, I didn't say who the organization was. I didn't brag. I didn't really do anything else. At the end of the conversation, we shut off the recording and we're still talking. And they said, really, where did that happen? And now I have the sales opportunity to say, well, gee, it was in front of 500 youth. This happened. I got a standing ovation for an extended period of time that almost embarrassed me. I had more people get engaged. Boom, 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 boom. And now all of a sudden, the client's interested in talking to me about coming in to speak to younger members of their organization.
Yeah. So you took a
Uh,
moment and like an example of them saying, hey, here's what works, and say, yeah, I've got an example as well. Here's a really cool one that they found really valuable. And I'm sure the listeners did too.
well, yeah. And then that gives me the opportunity that if whoever else is listening that might have that same issue say, wow, one of the early guests I had on was someone, and I target my guests to C-suite or at least upper management, depending on the size of the organization. And so I had an executive vice president on, and I had known him. He had seen me speak numerous times. We had had sales calls before, but he really had no interest in hiring me. Didn't think that he really needed me. He had the people in place, and I respected that. Had him on the podcast, had a great time in the podcast, got done with the podcast, promoted the podcast, and a month later he called me and said, I need you.
Hmm.
He hired me to come in to speak in DC for something. People in the audience then said, I need you to do this, then I need you to do that. And now I've had 5 different, uh, I have a consulting gig now and 4 different speaking gigs off of the fact that the guy that was on the podcast said he never needed.
That's fantastic. What I love about that, it just showcases the longevity of our efforts. Is we don't throw away a relationship because they don't want to do business with us. Because the reality is they said no just in that moment. Things change, organizations change, employees change, circumstances do. So you kept that alive and you still were offering him value and asked him to be a part of your, your podcast, and it kept those things alive, and look what came from it. That's really, really
Well,
awesome.
and I've had guests on that I did not feel I would ever get business from. So it's not just simply about that,
Hmm.
but I knew that they are good communicators. I
Right.
knew that they would be able to tell the advocacy story extremely well and talk about the great work that they're doing within their organizations. And because of that, that led to other quality guests,
Okay.
that has led to other quality guests. So one of the ways that if I'm looking for somebody, and I have a very specific targeted list, the type of organizations I want to be on. So I watch them, and I particularly watch them closely on LinkedIn. And if all of a sudden someone likes a social media post or comments on a social media post, then I'll go, if I don't know them, but yet they're in the industry, that tells me A, they're listening to the podcast and they're commenting about it. And I, in turn, then will just invite to connect. And then I'll look at who our mutual connections are. And, in some cases, it's 25, 30 people, yet we've never met. And I may then send a note in the message saying, hey, listen, we've got 25 mutual connections. And by the way, of those 25 mutual connections, 7 have already been guests on the Voices in Advocacy podcast. Boy, if you would ever have an interest as being a guest, please let me know. Really soft.
Mhm. Yeah.
And they'll come back with, yes, hey, send me information here. And it has led to some fascinating guests. And that becomes a multiplier, because
Right.
then the more people that are in each of these bubbles that are all listening to each other and knowing what's going on, and then past guests are making comments, and that's opening the doors to other people. And so, just like the spider web of social media works, part of what makes a podcast really work is the hard part of marketing it.
Yeah. So now that we've talked about what kind of the drive that you need, the purpose of your podcast, you getting clear on what you want to get from it, and then what your audience is going to get from the podcast. Let's say somebody has those things and they say, hey, actually, I think this would be a good idea because it aligns with my business goals. It's a good way to build credibility, things like that. Could you share just some of the simple, like maybe tools that you use, or things that you did just to say, oh, I'm going to do it now. Here's a few things that I can do to make it easier or to do it smarter.
Yeah, well, first of all, you have to figure out what hosting platform you choose to use, and there are a ton of them out there. They don't necessarily vary dramatically.
Mhm.
Uh, you can always change down the road on who hosts the podcast, but in my case, I chose Podbean. It's just who I chose. I've stuck with them. I see no reason not to use them. But one of the things that I learned was, where Podbean says, yes, it sends it out to all these other services, there are somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10 or 14 other services that redirect podcasts that you have to go out and get on your own. So when you set up an account on at least Podbean, and that's the one I know, that you have the ability to go in and look under where they have distribution.
Yeah.
And in the distribution link, then it'll say you have to individually connect with the following ones, and you start that process. But I would also tell solopreneurs that if you think that it's going to take a lot of time to do that, find somebody that knows all that and
Yeah.
hire them to do that. I'm always a kind of hands-on guy.
Hmm.
I like to know. I don't want to be held hostage, if you will, to any one individual that controls a large part of my business. And I
Yeah.
learned that many years ago, where I went out and I hired a great guy who did a fabulous job of building a great website. And then he went out and took another job, went to another city, and then became incredibly hard to find, to make edits, to do all those things. And I vowed at that point in time, I don't want to be held hostage by anybody controlling my brand, my imaging. I want to know enough that I can do it on my own if need be. I don't want to,
Yeah.
but if I have to, I know enough.
Yeah. Roger, this is perfect for me, man. How you talked about opportunities with your guests to do a little plug, like this is my sales opportunity. What you're describing is exactly why I started building websites for people. Is the number one frustration I talk about with people is someone built my site with complicated tools, left. I have no idea how to use it. Now they want this money to come back and fix it. So part of our value, if you're listening for the first time and you don't know what we do, our company was started by building websites, teaching you how to use them, offering a 100% money back guarantee, and 2 weeks worth of changes after it's done. So you can send it out to all your clients and get feedback. And you're going to get video lessons on how to use and change your website. And of course, if you want to pay a monthly maintenance fee and have our team do it, it's available. But the point is to, as you mentioned, like we as solopreneurs, we want to be in control of our business. We don't want to wait on somebody who's maybe on vacation or doing another project in order to update our business. So I just think that's so cool. So if you're out there listening right now and you need something and you don't want to do it yourself, maybe you've got the money and not the time, definitely go to marketingforspeakers.com. And we do have podcasting packages as well. We have staff members that will do your art, write your music, and then do the editing. They do it for this one. So if you think this is well edited, then this is the caliber that we offer. But shameless plug over. If you need help, go to marketingforspeakers.com.
Good shameless plug. You bring up a good point, because I did not know how to edit. I did not know how to blend music, create the bumpers, do voiceovers, do those kind of technical things. And I hired an engineer, and he was doing it part-time because he actually works in radio
Yeah.
and is in engineering and radio, and he's a sound engineer. Does a fantastic job. But then other things were coming up and he couldn't get them out when I needed them to be done. And so I picked up the phone and I called him and I said, okay, you got to come here, and now you're going to teach me. I'm going
Nice.
to pay you to teach me how to do this. And even if I use you later on for things, I at least understand what it is, and I can do things on the fly if I need to.
That's awesome. Definitely learning how to do the things yourself doesn't keep you reliant on another individual.
That's
So
correct.
I think we're running low on time, but I just want to thank you, Roger. You've been super generous with your stories, with your purpose, and then with some tips that we can use to, start a podcast. And of course, if anybody has more questions, they can comment on the website, on social media where we post this, and we'll answer your questions. Do you have any parting advice that you would give somebody who's trying to become a speaker, coach, kind of solopreneur, that might be helpful for them, whether with podcasting or not, but something that's been valuable, for your career, maybe?
The biggest thing is you have one reputation, and you have to protect it in everything that you do. Short-term gain often become long-term disaster if you compromise your integrity. So anybody out there needs to be in a position of really maintaining their family name, if you will, or the nature of their good name. I think that's vitally, vitally important. And particularly in the speaking industry, sadly, I have seen speakers that don't speak on certain topics get a phone call from somebody and say, gee, we like you. We've seen you speak. Can you speak on X or Y or Z? And you sit back and you think, well, gee, I probably can. Yeah, I can do that. Rather than saying, wait a minute, that's not my strength. My
Right.
strength is this. I can help you find somebody else. I will find you quality people, but I think it's really important to stay in your lane, do what you do best, and do it with a tremendous amount of integrity. And it will pay you back so many more times than you can ever earn.
Well said, Roger. Thank you so much for coming on the show, man. Big guy with the bow tie. We appreciate you so much. If y'all want to get in touch with Roger, I will include links to his LinkedIn profile, his podcast, the ways that you can get in touch with him. But until then, we're wishing you the best impact, income, and influence. Have a great day. See you on the next episode.